I was on stage to accept the Innovator of the Decade award when my stepfather whispered that he'd already stolen my entire life's work. He had no idea that I wasn't just the scientist behind the billion-dollar technology. I was the technology itself. The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel hung like frozen tears, casting a shimmer over a room filled with people who cost more to dress than my entire college tuition. This was supposed to be the pinnacle of my life, the night I received the Innovator of the Decade award for my work in biomechanical engineering. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, and the silk of my emerald green gown felt less like a garment and more like armor I wasn't quite strong enough to wear. I looked at the program in my trembling hands, my name printed in embossed gold, Elena Vance. I had spent years in windowless labs, surviving on black coffee and the sheer, stubborn will to prove that I wasn't the failure I'd been told I was. I had patented 3 separate prosthetic technologies before the age of 27, but as I sat at table 12, the seat felt like a hot stove, because sitting directly to my right was Richard. Richard, my stepfather, was a man who moved through the world with the unearned confidence of someone who had never been told no. He was a titan of real estate, a man who measured worth in zip codes and handshake deals. To the world, he was a philanthropist. To me, he was the man who had spent 15 years systematically trying to extinguish my spark. He leaned back in his chair, his custom-tailored tuxedo straining against his chest, and took a slow, deliberate sip of a vintage scotch that probably cost $400 a glass. "Look at you, Elena," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that only I could hear beneath the din of the room's chatter. "All dressed up like you belong here. It's almost convincing." I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty stage, where the podium stood bathed in a soft spotlight. "I do belong here, Richard. I earned this." He let out a short, dry chuckle that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "You earned a participation trophy in a field of nerds. Don't mistake a niche academic hobby for actual power. I'm only here because your mother insisted I witness this little moment of yours. She thinks it'll give you closure. I think it's just giving you delusions of grandeur." My mother, sitting on the other side of him, reached out and patted my hand. She looked beautiful, but her eyes were weary, the look of a woman who had spent 2 decades playing the role of a human shield. "He's just proud in his own way, honey," she lied, her voice thin. "We both are." "Proud?" Richard scoffed, loud enough that the neurosurgeon at the table next to us glanced over. "I'm proud that I managed to pay for that fancy prep school she almost flunked out of. I'm proud that I provided the roof over her head while she was busy playing with Legos in the garage. If anything, they should be giving me the award for subsidizing a decade of failure before she finally stumbled onto something marketable." The heat rose in my cheeks. I hadn't seen a dime of his money since I was 18. I had worked 3 jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. I had taken out loans that still made my stomach turn when I saw the statements. But Richard had a way of rewriting history so that he was the protagonist of every success and the victim of every failure. "I paid back every cent of the tuition, Richard," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts, "with interest, 2 years ago." "A drop in the bucket," he dismissed with a wave of his hand. He leaned closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and arrogance rolling off him in waves. "Enjoy the little plastic statue, Elena. But remember, when the lights go out tonight, you're still that stuttering, clumsy girl who couldn't even pass basic algebra without a tutor I had to hire. You're a fluke, and I'm the only one here honest enough to tell you that." I felt the familiar, cold, familiar hand of imposter syndrome tightening around my throat. For a moment, the ballroom didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a trap. I looked around the room at the titans of industry, the brilliant researchers, the Nobel laureates. Richard was right, wasn't he? They were the real deal. I was just a girl from a broken home who had worked herself to the bone out of spite. The master of ceremonies, a distinguished man with a voice like velvet, stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the most anticipated honor of the evening, the Vanguard Award for Innovation." A hush fell over the room. My heart hammered. This was it. "This year's recipient," the MC continued, "has not only revolutionized the way we approach neural link prosthetics, but has done so with a grace and tenacity that defines the next generation of science. Her work has already restored mobility to thousands of veterans and accident survivors." I felt a tiny spark of pride flare up, but Richard's heavy hand landed on my shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle with a bruising grip. "Don't get too comfortable," he hissed. "I have a little surprise for your big speech, a little reality check for the audience. I think they'd love to hear about the real Elena Vance, the one who was nearly expelled for borrowing lab equipment, the one who's nothing more than a thief of my resources." My blood ran cold. I knew that tone. Richard didn't make idle threats. He had been talking to people all night, shaking hands, leaning into ears. He was a master of the whispered smear campaign. "Please," the MC announced, his voice booming through the speakers, "join me in welcoming to the stage, Dr. Elena Vance." The room erupted in thunderous applause. The spotlight swung around, blinding me, pinning me to my seat like a butterfly to a board. I began to stand, my legs feeling like lead, but Richard didn't let go of my shoulder. Instead, he stood up with me. He didn't just stand to let me out. He stepped into the aisle, blocking my path to the stage. He adjusted his jacket, a smirk playing on his lips that promised total destruction. He wasn't going to let me walk up there alone. He was going to take the mic. He was going to introduce me in a way that would haunt my career forever. As I took my first trembling step, Richard reached out and snatched the printed copy of my acceptance speech right out of my hand. He crumpled it into a ball and dropped it into his half-empty glass of scotch. "You won't be needing that," he whispered, loud enough for the people in the front row to hear. "I'll handle the talking. It's time the world knew who really built this genius." He started toward the stage, his chest puffed out, leaving me standing in the shadows of the spotlight, empty-handed and paralyzed. But just as he reached the stairs, a tall, shadow-like figure stepped out from the wings of the stage, intercepting Richard with the cold, calculated precision of a predator. It was Dr. Eris Thorne, my mentor, the most feared man in the scientific community, and the only person Richard actually feared. Thorne didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at Richard, and for the first time in my life, I saw my stepfather flinch. Thorne reached out a hand, resting it on the podium, and his voice, amplified by the live mic, cut through the applause like a razor. "Sit down, Richard," Thorne said, his voice quiet but echoing with a terrifying authority that silenced the entire ballroom. "Before I tell this room exactly why your name is on my blacklist." The silence that followed Dr. Thorne's words was so thick you could have carved it with a scalpel. All 500 guests, the elite of the scientific and financial worlds, seemed to hold their breath in unison. Richard stood frozen on the second step of the stage, his hand still hovering near the microphone, his face a mottled shade of purple that clashed horribly with the warm stage lighting. For a second, I thought he might actually swing at Thorne. Richard was used to being the biggest dog in the room, the one who barked and made everyone else scatter. But Eris Thorne wasn't just a scientist. He was a titan in his own right, a man whose patents generated more annual revenue than Richard's entire real estate empire. "Eris," Richard said, his voice forced and tight, attempting a jovial smile that looked more like a snarl. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just here as a proud father. I wanted to give Elena the introduction she deserves." "The introduction she deserves," Thorne repeated, his voice projected perfectly by the lapel mic he was already wearing, "is one of merit, not one of patronizing ownership. You've done enough handling for one lifetime, Richard. Step down." I stood in the aisle, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. My mother was half risen from her seat, her face a mask of terror. She knew Richard's temper. She knew that behind closed doors, this public humiliation would have a steep price. I wanted to tell her to sit down, to tell Thorne to let it go, to just disappear into the floorboards. But then I remembered the damp, cold nights in the garage. I remembered the way Richard had laughed when I told him I got into MIT, calling it a waste of a good marriageable age. Richard didn't step down. He took another step up, closing the distance between him and Thorne. He was taller than Thorne, broader, and he used his size like a weapon. "This is a family matter, Doctor. I suggest you stay in your lab and leave the social graces to men who understand them. I have supported Elena's hobbies for years. I have a right to speak." He turned to the audience, spreading his arms wide, pivoting into his charismatic billionaire persona. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse the drama. As many of you know, brilliance often comes with a bit of temperament. My daughter, Elena, is a singular talent, but as her benefactor, I feel it's my duty to ensure the full story is told. Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires capital. It requires a firm hand to guide it. And while Elena's name is on the plaque, the foundation of her work was built under my roof, using my company's proprietary data streams." A collective murmur rippled through the room. This wasn't just a stepfather being a jerk. This was a public claim of intellectual property theft. If Richard could prove, or even just convincingly lie, that my work belonged to his firm, my career was over before it had truly begun. The innovator of the decade would be rebranded as a corporate thief. "That's a lie," I whispered, but my voice didn't carry. Richard looked down at me from the stage, his eyes glinting with a cruel triumph. He reached into his inner tuxedo pocket and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. "I have the logs right here," he said to the room, his voice booming. "Logs that show Elena accessing my firm's secure servers during her breakthrough period. I didn't want to bring this up tonight. I wanted to celebrate her. But I cannot, in good conscience, allow this award to be given under false pretenses. Elena, honey, I'm doing this for your own good. Integrity is worth more than a trophy." The MC looked panicked. The event organizers were whispering frantically at the side of the stage. People were pulling out their phones, the flash of cameras catching the sweat on my forehead. I felt like I was drowning. He had faked logs. He had planned this. He wasn't just trying to shame me. He was trying to legally own me, to fold my patents into his portfolio. Thorne, however, hadn't moved an inch. He didn't look shocked. He didn't even look angry anymore. He looked bored. "Are you finished, Richard?" Thorne asked. "I think the evidence speaks for itself," Richard said, holding the flash drive up like a holy relic. "I'm sure the board will want to review this before proceeding with the ceremony." Thorne took a slow step toward the podium. "It's funny you mention integrity, and it's even funnier that you brought that drive. Because, you see, Richard, I've been waiting for you to make a move like this for exactly 3 years. Thorne turned to the tech booth at the back of the hall. "Mark, could you kill the house lights and bring up the secondary feed on the main screen? The one I sent you this morning labeled insurmountable evidence." Richard's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you've never had a secure server in your life that wasn't managed by a third-party firm," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and lethal. "A firm that I happen to own the majority share of. You didn't track Elena's usage of your data, Richard. You used those servers to try and siphon her research into your accounts. You've been trying to hack your own stepdaughter's encrypted cloud for months." The giant screen behind the stage flickered to life. It didn't show my research. It showed a series of recorded video calls, internal meetings from Richard's real estate firm. In the video, Richard was sitting at the head of a boardroom table, his face twisted in a way the public never saw. "I don't care if it's legal," the Richard on the screen growled. "She's a kid. She's living under my roof. Anything that comes out of her head belongs to me. Find a way to mirror her drives. If she gets that grant, I want that money redirected to the holding company. If she complains, I'll make sure she looks like a mental case. Who are they going to believe? A 22-year-old girl or me?" The ballroom went deathly silent. Richard turned white, the purple draining from his face until he looked like a ghost in a tuxedo. That's a deep fake," Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "This is a setup. This is an illegal invasion of privacy." "Actually," Thorne said, leaning casually against the podium, "it's a whistleblower submission from your own head of IT, who happens to be sitting at table 4. But that's not even the best part, Richard." Thorne looked at me and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. I realized then that Thorne hadn't just been my mentor, he had been my guardian. He had been building a case while I was building machines. "The best part," Thorne continued, turning back to the horrified audience, "is that the proprietary data Richard claims Elena stole wasn't just her own work. It was a honeypot, a trap designed specifically to catch someone attempting a corporate raid. And Richard, you didn't just walk into it, you sprinted." Thorne tapped a button on his phone and the screen changed. It showed a legal document, a filing with the SEC and the district attorney's office. "As of 20 minutes ago," Thorne said, "your assets have been frozen pending a federal investigation into industrial espionage and grand larceny. But there's one more thing you should know before the security guards arrive to escort you out." Thorne paused, a predatory smile finally touching his lips. "Elena isn't the only one who's been keeping secrets. Tell me, Richard, how's your wife's health insurance policy doing? The one you tried to cancel last week without telling her?" My mother gasped, her hand flying to her throat. I looked at her, then back at Richard, who was trembling so hard the flash drive slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the stage. But it wasn't the insurance comment that broke the room. It was the woman who suddenly stood up from the very back of the hall, a woman I hadn't seen in 10 years, a woman Richard had told me was dead. The woman at the back of the room moved with a ghostly, rhythmic elegance, her silhouette cutting through the haze of the ballroom's cigarette smoke and expensive perfume. As she stepped into the light of the center aisle, a collective gasp swept through the front tables like a gust of wind. She was tall, her hair a striking shock of silver that framed a face etched with both beauty and a decade of suppressed rage. "Julianne?" My mother's voice was a fragile thread, barely audible over the hum of the crowd. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Richard looked like he was having a stroke. The arrogant, broad-shouldered titan of industry seemed to shrink within his tuxedo, his skin turning a sickly, translucent gray. "No," he whispered, his eyes wide and fixed on the woman. "It isn't possible. You're in the clinic. You're dead?" Julianne finished for him, her voice amplified by the silence of the room. She didn't need a microphone. Her presence filled every corner of the grand ballroom. "That's what you told your new family, wasn't it, Richard? That's what you told the board of directors 10 years ago when you staged my mental collapse and had me committed to a private facility in the Swiss Alps?" She stopped at the foot of the stage, her gaze moving from Richard to me. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, a look of recognition and profound sadness, before hardening back into flint as she looked up at the man who had erased her life. "I'm not a ghost, Richard," she said. "I'm the majority shareholder you forgot to legally bury." The room descended into chaos. Reporters from the back of the hall scrambled toward the front, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Richard's personal security team moved to intervene, but they were stopped by a wall of men in dark suits who had emerged from the side entrances, men with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. I felt like the world was spinning. Julianne. I remembered that name from the old newspaper clippings I'd found in the attic years ago. Richard's first wife, a brilliant venture capitalist who had allegedly died in a tragic car accident shortly after their divorce. Richard had used her inheritance to build the foundation of his real estate empire. My mother had always been told it was a closed chapter, a tragedy that Richard was too pained to discuss. "What is this?" I finally found my voice, stepping toward the edge of the stage. My legs were shaking, but the fire in my chest was growing. "Richard, who is she?" Richard didn't answer me. He didn't even look at me. He was looking at Dr. Thorne, who was still leaning calmly against the podium, a spectator at a play he had spent years directing. "You!" Richard spat, the venom returning to his voice as he pivoted back to Thorne. "You've been behind this. You tracked her down. You've been funneling my money to keep her hidden until tonight." "Not your money, Richard," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cold. "The money you stole from her. And more importantly, the money you've been siphoning from Elena's father's estate for the last 15 years. My heart stopped. My father's estate. My father died in debt. Richard took us in because we had nothing. Thorne turned to me, his expression softening into something resembling genuine compassion. "Elena, your father didn't die in debt. He was the lead architect on the very patents you've spent your life perfecting. He died with a portfolio worth tens of millions, a portfolio that was left in a trust for you, with Richard as the temporary executor until you reached the age of 25. "That's a lie," Richard roared, lunging toward Thorne. The federal agents were faster. They swarmed the stage, pinning Richard against the podium. The heavy Innovator of the Decade trophy tumbled to the floor, the base cracking against the marble. Richard struggled, his face pressed against the wood, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Check the records, Elena!" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "Check the dates! Your father was a failure. He was a drunk who drove his car off a bridge. I saved you. I gave you everything." Julianne stepped up onto the stage, her heels clicking with a lethal precision. She walked over to the podium and looked down at Richard. "The car didn't go off the bridge because he was drunk, Richard. It went off the bridge because the brake lines were tampered with. I know, because I was the one who found the mechanic you paid. I've spent 10 years in that clinic talking to the nurses you bribed, waiting for the one person who could finally break your encryption." She looked at Thorne, then back to me. "I wasn't the only one Richard was drugging, Elena," Julianne said, her voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. I looked down at my mother. She was slumped in her chair, her eyes unfocused, her breathing shallow and labored. She had been ill for years, mysterious bouts of fatigue, memory loss, a general weariness that Richard always insisted was the result of the stress of my career. "Mom!" I jumped off the stage, rushing to her side. I grabbed her hand. It was ice cold. "Mom, look at me. What did he do to you?" "The insurance policy." Thorne's voice echoed through the room. Richard wasn't just waiting for the payout on her life, Elena. He was using her medical power of attorney to authorize the experimental treatments that were actually just a way to keep her sedated and compliant while he liquidated the last of your father's trust. The anger I had felt before was nothing compared to the cold, white-hot rage that washed over me now. Everything. My father's death, my mother's illness, my own struggling career. It had all been a chess game played by a man who saw people as nothing more than assets to be stripped. Richard laughed then. It was a jagged, hysterical sound that sent shivers down my spine. Even pinned by 3 agents, he managed to look up at me with a sickening grin. "You think you've won?" Richard wheezed. "You think this little theatrics changes anything? The trust is gone, Elena. I spent the last of it 6 months ago to cover my losses in the Tokyo market. Even if you put me in a cage, you're broke. Your mother is a vegetable. And your precious mentor? Ask him why he really took an interest in you. Ask him about the accident 15 years ago." I looked up at Dr. Thorne. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the back of the room. The color had drained from his face. "Dr. Thorne?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What is he talking about?" Thorne didn't answer. He was looking at the woman with silver hair, and for the first time I realized they weren't strangers. Julianne wasn't just Richard's first wife. She was Thorne's sister, but it was the next thing Richard said that shattered the last of my world. "Tell her, heiress," Richard hissed, a dark triumph in his eyes. "Tell her who was driving the other car the night her father died." The ballroom, which only moments ago had felt like the pinnacle of my existence, now felt like a crumbling tomb. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the camera flashes and the metallic tang of my own terror. I looked at Dr. Thorne, the man who had plucked me from obscurity, who had pushed me to be better, who had been the only father figure I ever truly respected. His silence was a deafening confirmation. He didn't roar a denial. He didn't laugh at the absurdity. He simply stood there, his shadow long and jagged against the screen that displayed Richard's crimes. "Is it true?" I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. I was still kneeling by my mother, her hand limp in mine. "Were you there? Did you kill him?" Thorne's eyes finally met mine. They weren't the cold, calculating eyes of a mentor. They were hollow, filled with a decade of haunted sleep. "I was driving, Elena," he said, his voice barely a murmur, "but I wasn't the one who caused the crash." "Liars, all of you!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking as the agents forced him toward the edge of the stage. "He's been playing you, Elena. He found the daughter of the man he killed and groomed her. He didn't give you a scholarship out of the goodness of his heart. He gave it to you to keep his conscience quiet. He's been buying your forgiveness with patents and trophies." Julianne stepped forward, her silver hair shimmering like a blade. "Shut up, Richard," she hissed. She turned to me, her expression pained. "Elena, it wasn't what it looks like. Eris and your father were partners. They were working on the first iteration of the neural link. Richard found out. He knew the technology was worth billions, but he couldn't get near the patents while your father and my brother were a united front. So he broke them," I said, the realization washing over me like ice water. "He sabotaged both cars," Thorne said, stepping down from the podium, his voice gaining strength. "He wanted us both gone. That night, your father was supposed to meet me at the lab. I saw his car swerve. I saw the sparks. I tried to pit my car against his to keep him from going over the guardrail. I failed. My car stayed on the road. His didn't." Thorne stopped a few feet from me. "I spent 3 years in physical therapy. I spent another 5 searching for the proof that it was Richard. By the time I found it, he had already married your mother. He had buried Julianne in a psychiatric ward. He was untouchable. So I waited. I watched you. I saw your father's brilliance in you, and I knew that the only way to truly destroy Richard was to give you the tools to take back everything he stole." The room was a cacophony of murmurs. The scandal was no longer just about corporate theft. It was about a decade-long conspiracy of murder and kidnapping. "You used me," I said, standing up, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. "You used my career as a weapon for your revenge." "I gave you a future, Elena," Thorne said softly, "one that Richard tried to drown." Suddenly, my mother's fingers twitched in mine. Her eyes, which had been clouded and distant, suddenly sharpened. She let out a jagged, rattling breath and grabbed my arm with surprising strength. The safe," she rasped, her voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Elena, the study." Richard froze. Even with his arms pinned, he went perfectly still. The wild, cornered look in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. "Sarah, don't," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Think about what you're doing." "The study?" I asked, leaning in close to her. "What's in the study, Mom?" The blue folder," she whispered, her eyes darting to Richard with a look of pure, unadulterated fear. "He didn't just take the money. He took the letters from your father. He knew, Elena. He knew the crash was coming." The federal agents began to lead Richard away, but as they reached the stairs, Richard did something unexpected. He stopped resisting. He leaned into the ear of the lead agent and whispered something. The agent paused, his eyebrows shooting up. "Wait," the agent said, signaling for the others to stop. Richard turned his head back toward the stage, a slow, hideous grin spreading across his face. The lost man was gone. The Titan was back. "You think you've uncovered a conspiracy?" Richard asked, his voice echoing with a new, chilling confidence. "You've barely scratched the surface of the paperwork. You want to talk about the blue folder, Sarah? You want to talk about the letters?" He looked directly at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something that looked like pity. "Elena, did you ever wonder why your father was so desperate for that funding? Why he was working in the garage until 4 in the morning? It wasn't because he was a visionary. It was because he was being blackmailed. By your mentor, Dr. Thorne." I looked back at Thorne. He didn't look away this time. His face was a mask of stone. "He was the one who funded the original research," Richard continued, his voice dripping with malice. "And when your father tried to walk away because the technology was being tested on human subjects illegally, Thorne threatened to ruin him. The accident wasn't just a way for me to get the money, Elena. It was a way for Thorne to get the data. He needed your father dead so he could take the research and perfect it." "That's not true," Julianne said, though her voice lacked conviction. She looked at her brother, her eyes searching his face for a denial that didn't come. "Ask him," Richard challenged. "Ask him about the Sigma project. Ask him why the first 3 patients who received the prototypes died of brain hemorrhages, and then ask him why your mother was really being drugged." I turned to Thorne, the world tilting on its axis. "What is he talking about? Sigma project? Thorne, tell me he's lying." Thorne didn't look at me. He looked at my mother, who had begun to cry, not with sadness, but with a terrifying, rhythmic sobbing. "I did what was necessary for the science, Elena," Thorne said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your father was a dreamer. He didn't have the stomach for what it took to change the world. But I did." Before I could process the betrayal, the giant screen behind the stage flickered again. It wasn't Thorne's evidence anymore. It was a live feed of my laboratory, my private lab at the university where I kept the core of my research. The lab was being ransacked. Men in tactical gear were loading my prototypes into crates, and standing in the middle of my lab, directing the operation with a cold, professional efficiency, was my own lead research assistant, the person I trusted more than anyone. "You see, Elena," Richard said, his voice a purr of victory as the agents began to lead him out again, this time with a strange deference. "You were never the innovator. You were just the decoy. The award, the speech, the revelations tonight. It was all a distraction." A high-pitched, piercing alarm began to sound from my phone. It was the emergency override for my server. Someone was wiping my work. Every patent, every line of code, every scrap of my life's work was being deleted in real time. The real work is already on its way to a buyer who doesn't care about ethics or Vanguard awards, Richard called out over his shoulder. But then, the ballroom doors at the very back slammed open. A team of people I didn't recognize, dressed in the uniforms of a private security firm I'd only seen in news reports about international conflicts, marched in, weapons drawn. They didn't go for Richard. They didn't go for Thorne. They headed straight for me. "Dr. Vance," the lead soldier said, his voice distorted by a tactical mask, "you're coming with us. The Board of Governors has invoked the national security provision." "What board?" I yelled, backing away as they surrounded the stage. "What are you talking about?" The soldier didn't answer. He looked at Thorne, and for the first time I saw Thorne look truly terrified. "They aren't here for the research, Elena," Thorne whispered, his voice shaking. "They're here because of what's inside you." He lunged for me, but not to attack. He grabbed my arm, his fingers pressing into a small, hard lump beneath my skin I had always thought was just a scar from a childhood fall. "The prototype didn't fail," Thorne hissed into my ear as the soldiers closed in. "Your father didn't die for the science. He died to hide the fact that you were the first successful host." At that moment, the lights in the ballroom didn't just flicker. They died completely. In the darkness, a voice whispered from the speakers, a voice that sounded exactly like my father. "Run, Elena. They've found the heartbeat." The darkness was total, a thick velvet weight that pressed against my eyes. But in that void, I didn't feel blind. For the first time in my life, I felt awake. The voice of my father hadn't come from the speakers. It had resonated inside my skull, a bone conduction frequency that bypassed my ears entirely. My pulse, which had been a frantic tapping, suddenly smoothed out into a rhythmic electronic hum. The small, hard lump in my arm, the scar I'd carried since the age of 12, throbbed with a low blue heat that I could see beneath my skin. "Thermal vision engaged," the voice whispered. It wasn't my father's ghost. It was an AI, a dormant sentinel coded with his vocal patterns. The ballroom transformed. The world turned into a landscape of heat signatures. I saw the soldiers as hulking orange masses, their weapons glowing a dangerous red. I saw Thorne standing frozen, his heart a frantic pulse in his chest. And I saw Richard, already being moved toward the service exit by two men whose heat signatures were unnaturally cold, augmented. "They're moving the asset," the lead soldier shouted, his voice muffled by the dark. "Find her, use the tracers." A red laser dot appeared on my chest, centered right over my heart. They weren't here to protect me. They were here to harvest me. "Elena, listen to me." Thorne's voice came from the dark, desperate, and raw. "The Sigma project wasn't just a neural link. It was a bridge. Your father knew he couldn't protect the data from Richard or the board, so he encrypted the entire architecture into your nervous system. You aren't just the host, Elena. You are the hard drive." "And you let him do it?" I yelled, ducking behind a heavy mahogany table as a volley of non-lethal pulse rounds shattered the crystal centerpieces above me. "I helped him," Thorne shouted back. "It was the only way to keep you alive. Richard would have killed you the day your father died if he hadn't known you were the only key to the vault." The betrayal was so deep, it felt like it had its own gravity. My entire life, the labs, the late nights, the genius, breakthroughs, it had all been a calibrated path to this moment. They hadn't wanted me to be a scientist. They had wanted me to be a functional interface for the technology I thought I was creating. "Initiating override," the voice in my head said. "System, grand ballroom, protocol, blackout." Suddenly, the hum in my arms surged. I felt a pull in my gut, a drain of energy, and then every electronic device in the room, the soldiers' night vision goggles, their radios, the hovering drones, exploded in a shower of sparks. The soldiers screamed, clawing at their blinded eyes. In the chaos, I didn't run for the exit. I ran for the stage. I found Richard near the service door. He was struggling with his captors, his face a mask of primal greed. He saw me coming, the girl he had belittled, the daughter he had tried to erase, and for the first time, he saw the blue light pulsing in my eyes. "Give it to me, Elena," he shrieked, reaching out with a hand that shook. "I made you. I kept you fed. I kept your mother alive. You owe me that code." "I don't owe you anything but the truth," I said. I reached out and grabbed his wrist. The interface in my arm didn't just connect to computers, it connected to everything electronic. I felt the encrypted files on the flash drive in his pocket. I felt the digital trails of his offshore accounts, the bribe payments to the Swiss clinic, the commands he'd sent to sabotage my father's car. "The board is coming for you, Elena," Richard hissed, his face inches from mine. "You think you're a person. You're a weapon of the state. You'll spend the rest of your life in a windowless room being stripped for parts." "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm an engineer, and I know how to decommission a faulty unit." I pushed my consciousness into the drive in his pocket. I didn't just delete the data, I mirrored it. I sent every shred of evidence, the videos, the logs, the Sigma files, to every major news outlet, every federal server, and every member of the very board Richard served. I turned his own weapon into a flare, lighting up his crimes for the entire world to see. The doors to the ballroom burst open. Not more soldiers, but the real authorities, the ones Julianne had brought. The lights flickered back on, and the scene was one of total ruin. Richard was on his knees, his prestige stripped away as the world watched his digital confession play out on every smartphone in the room. Thorne stood at the edge of the stage, his hands raised in surrender. He looked at me, his eyes full of a complicated, tragic pride. "You finished the work, Elena. You stabilized the link." "I destroyed it," I said, the blue light in my arm fading to a dull, permanent hum. "The architecture is gone, Eris. I burnt the bridge." It was a lie, of course. I hadn't destroyed it. I had internalized it. The code was mine now. It wasn't a product to be sold or a secret to be kept. It was my voice. 6 months later, the grand ballroom was a memory. Richard was facing life in a federal penitentiary, his empire dismantled and sold off to pay the reparations for the families he had destroyed. Julianne had taken over the remains of his firm, turning it into a foundation for medical ethics. My mother was recovering in a facility that didn't involve sedation, her memory slowly returning like a morning mist clearing away. I stood on the balcony of my new lab, a private facility built on the coast, far from the reach of boards and governors. Thorne was gone, exiled from the scientific community, though I knew he was out there somewhere watching the horizon. I looked at the Vanguard Award sitting on my desk. I had had the plaque changed. It no longer said Innovator of the Decade. It said Elena Vance, architect of her own future. I touched the scar on my arm. The heartbeat was still there, a quiet, steady rhythm that reminded me I was never truly alone. My father hadn't left me a fortune, and he hadn't left me a legacy of ghost stories. He had given me the one thing Richard could never understand, the power to speak for myself. I turned back to my monitors, the code flowing through my mind as easily as breath. There was work to be done, real work this time. And as the sun set over the ocean, I finally knew what it felt like to be more than a prototype. I was the breakthrough,